Humans have invented some remarkably sophisticated ways to lose things. Today, you can lose money with cards, dice, horse races, sports apps, roulette wheels, or a machine covered in flashing fruit. But strip away the neon lights, the tuxedos, and the suspiciously confident guy who says he has a system, and gambling becomes something much simpler. You own something, you risk it, and then you let uncertainty decide whether you still own it 5 minutes later. Which raises a strange question. Who looked at randomness and thought, you know what this needs? Stakes. Probably no single person. Gambling seems to have emerged gradually from something far older than casinos, the human obsession with uncertain outcomes. Long before money existed, our ancestors were already living in a world where food, weather, hunting, alliances, and survival itself depended on probabilities they could never fully control. Eventually, humans did what humans always do. We turned anxiety into entertainment. Before humans could gamble, they needed something much more basic than dice, cards, or a friend willing to make terrible financial decisions with them. They needed brains capable of dealing with uncertainty. For most of human evolution, uncertainty was not entertainment. It was Tuesday. A hunter could follow tracks for hours and return with enough meat to feed several families. Or nothing. A forager might choose one patch of land because yesterday it was full of edible plants, only to discover that another group had already been there. Weather changed. Animals moved, rivers flooded, injuries happened. Other humans occasionally decided to become a problem. Our ancestors survived by constantly making decisions without knowing exactly how those decisions would end. And that matters, because gambling is basically decision-making under uncertainty with unnecessary accessories. Modern studies of humans and other primates show that brains do not respond only to rewards themselves. Dopamine systems are heavily involved in learning the difference between expected and unexpected outcomes, helping organisms update what they think will happen next. Researchers have even found neural activity associated specifically with uncertainty when rewards are probabilistic, which sounds suspiciously familiar if you have ever watched someone stare at a roulette ball like they are attempting telepathy. But there is an important distinction here. This does not mean evolution created a gambling circuit. Your Paleolithic ancestors were not crouching behind a mammoth whispering, 20 pieces of flint says Kevin gets trampled. The machinery came first. Natural selection favored brains that could learn from variable environments, estimate possibilities, remember successful choices, and decide whether a risky opportunity might be worth pursuing. Research on primate and human foraging shows that food acquisition can involve exactly these kinds of trade-offs between uncertain but valuable resources and safer alternatives. Gambling appears to hijack that ancient machinery by manufacturing uncertainty on purpose. That is the strange evolutionary twist. For millions of years, uncertainty was something humans tried to manage because getting it wrong could mean hunger. Then, eventually, somebody discovered that uncertainty could also be fun. Once humans had food to share, objects to value, social status to compete over, and enough spare time to play, the old survival question, what happens if I take this chance, could become something completely different. What happens if I bet on it? And to answer that question, humans needed a machine for producing unpredictable outcomes. Fortunately, nature had already manufactured millions of them. They were inside animals. More specifically, they were in the ankles. Sheep, goats, deer, cattle, and other hoofed animals have a small bone called the astragalus, part of the ankle joint. Unlike an ordinary scrap of bone, an astragalus is compact, durable, easy to hold, and shaped in a wonderfully inconvenient way. Throw one onto the ground and it can settle on different faces. Congratulations! Nature has invented a terrible little dice prototype. Archaeologists have found astragali across ancient Eurasia, sometimes modified by cutting, polishing, drilling, weighting, or marking them. They are commonly interpreted as gaming pieces, divination objects, protective objects, or some combination of those roles. Natural and worked examples appear in archaeological contexts going back to the Neolithic, although simply finding a knucklebone does not prove somebody was gambling with it. And this is where the story becomes frustratingly prehistoric. Nobody recorded the first time someone threw one for fun. There is no clay tablet saying, "Today, Greg discovered gambling. Greg now owes me 3 goats." So the accidental discovery part of this story has to remain a hypothesis. But it is not difficult to imagine the pathway. Humans butcher animals constantly. Astragali survive well, feel satisfying in the hand, and behave unpredictably when tossed. Children could play with them. Adults could compete with them. Different landing positions could acquire different values. Once outcomes have values, another possibility appears. What do I get if mine wins? That tiny question changes everything. Because a randomizer does something socially powerful. It creates an outcome that neither participant completely controls. You do not need a referee to decide which throw lands best if everyone already agrees that one face is worth more than another. And if nobody understands probability yet, randomness can feel like something much stranger than mathematics. Fate. Across later ancient societies, astragali were used not only for games but also in ritual and divination. A major assemblage from Hellenistic Meretia, for example, contained more than 600 astragali associated with both gaming and divinatory practices, showing just how easily throwing bones could occupy the blurry territory between play and supernatural consultation. That overlap makes perfect human sense. Throw a bone once and you have an unpredictable result. Throw it repeatedly and you have a game. Ask the gods what the result means, and you have religion. Put something valuable on the outcome, now we have gambling. Or at least, something very close to it. The problem is proving exactly when humans crossed that final line, because archaeology preserves bones much better than it preserves bad decisions. Eventually, chance stopped leaving us only mysterious bones and started leaving behind equipment. And some of it was fancy. Around 2600 to 2400 BCE, people at the ancient Mesopotamian city of Ur were buried with elaborate game boards made from wood, shell, and decorative inlays. Archaeologists later recovered several examples from the royal cemetery at Ur, including the object now famous as the Royal Game of Ur. The British Museum dates one of its best-preserved boards to roughly 2600-2400 BCE. This was not somebody scratching squares into dirt because dinner was taking too long. The board contains 20 decorated squares, and associated finds include circular gaming counters and small tetrahedral dice. The Penn Museum notes that gaming boards, disc-shaped pieces, and four-sided dice were discovered in the tombs at Ur, and that versions of the game were not restricted to royalty. Ancient Mesopotamia had apparently reached the stage where random chance came with accessories. The game itself was a race. Players moved pieces according to results generated by throwing dice-like objects, and later evidence helped scholars reconstruct enough of the rules that the Royal Game of Ur is often described as the oldest board game whose play can be meaningfully reconstructed. But here is the annoying archaeological catch. A game of chance is not automatically gambling. We have the board, we have the pieces, we have the randomizer. What we usually do not have is the wager. Coins had not even been invented when these Ur boards were made, and a bet could have involved food, livestock, valuables, labor, favors, or something archaeologically invisible. Unless somebody wrote down the stakes, the evidence cannot tell us whether two players were risking property or simply trying to destroy a friendship before lunch. This problem follows gambling throughout archaeology. Objects survive, rules sometimes survive, arguments over who owed whom 3 jars of beer generally do not. Elsewhere, the physical evidence keeps multiplying. Egyptian games such as Senet used casting devices including knucklebones, or throwing sticks to determine movement, while later Greek and Roman cultures made extensive use of astragali as games of chance. So by the Bronze Age, one thing is unmistakable. Humans had learned to manufacture uncertainty. They built boards around it, assigned values to it, carried specialized pieces for it, and sometimes buried the equipment with the dead. What archaeology cannot always tell us is when entertainment became wagering. And that missing distinction creates one of the biggest arguments in the entire history of gambling. Here is where archaeology runs into a deeply annoying problem. A bone cannot tell you why someone threw it. The same astragalus might have been a toy in one household, a gambling device in another, and a sacred object in a temple. Archaeological and historical evidence shows that knucklebones were used both for games and for divination across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Even luxury versions existed, including stone examples clearly identified as gaming pieces or fortune-telling objects. Which makes the question when was gambling invented much harder than it sounds. Because first we have to decide what counts as gambling. If 2 children throw bones and keep score, that is a game. If 2 adults throw the same bones and the loser gives up a goat, that is gambling. If a priest throws them and announces that the gods strongly recommend invading your neighbor, that is apparently foreign policy. The object barely changes. The meaning changes completely. This has led to several competing possibilities about how gambling emerged. One possibility is that games came first. Humans enjoy competition, and randomizing devices make competition more unpredictable. Eventually, someone attached property or prestige to the outcome. Another possibility is that divination played an important role. In many ancient traditions, casting bones or dice could be interpreted as revealing supernatural intention. Greek and Roman evidence shows both ordinary dice and astragali being used in divinatory settings. If people already believed a throw could reveal fate, wagering on that throw is not a huge conceptual leap. But we should be careful. There is no archaeological receipt saying divination became gambling on Thursday. And scholars cannot simply assume that every deposit of astragali represents gamblers. Large collections have also been connected with ritual activity, sacrifice, burial practices, and other symbolic uses. Research on perforated astragali in the ancient Levant, for example, has explored connections with ritual practices rather than straightforward gaming. There is another problem too. Gambling does not preserve well. A wager is an agreement, not an artifact. Two people might bet food, labor, clothing, animals, favors, or social obligations and leave behind exactly the same gaming equipment as people playing for absolutely nothing. So archaeologists are often staring at the prehistoric equivalent of a poker table with all the money removed. We know people played. We know people generated random outcomes. We know later societies unquestionably gambled. What we cannot see clearly is the exact moment when somebody looked at chance, looked at their possessions, and decided those two things should meet. Civilization would make that decision much easier to spot. Once gambling entered cities, something changed. Chance was no longer just a strange thing you could summon by throwing a bone. It became social infrastructure. In the Greek and Roman worlds, dice games appeared alongside drinking, banquets, public entertainment, and everyday leisure. Roman dice survive in bone, ivory, glass, and even semi-precious stone, suggesting that random chance had graduated from convenient animal leftovers to something people were willing to manufacture deliberately. Met Museum. Org W Met Museum. Org Art Collection Search 2399 UTM Source ChatGPT. And wherever gambling becomes popular, humanity tends to invent its traditional companion. Cheating. Roman players sometimes used small throwing cups to prevent people from manipulating dice with their hands. The Metropolitan Museum notes that such cups helped guard against unfair throws during games that were common at banquets and other social gatherings. Met Museum. Org Art Collection Search 547955 UTM Source ChatGPT. Think about what that means. You do not invent anti-cheating technology unless somebody has already ruined game night. By this period, gambling could involve far more than throwing dice. People wagered on races and other competitions, while board games could combine strategy with randomized movement. The Roman game tabula, for example, used 3 dice to move 15 pieces for each player, and the British Museum describes it as usually being played as a gambling game. British Museum, org https British Museum, org collection object G 1892-01211, UTM source ChatGPT. But gambling was becoming socially important for another reason. It moved value between people without requiring trade, labor, inheritance, or violence. Usually, a successful wager could transform a small possession into a larger one almost instantly. That made gambling exciting, dangerous, and wonderfully portable. You did not need farmland. You did not need a workshop. You needed stakes, uncertainty, and another human convinced that luck personally liked them. At the same time, the older connection between chance and the supernatural never completely disappeared. In parts of Roman-era Asia Minor, dice oracles allowed people to cast dice and consult inscribed answers for divine guidance about personal or public decisions. Met Museum, Orgot Met Museum, Orgart Collection Search 246446, UTM Source ChatGPT. So the same basic technology could answer 2 very different questions. Will I win? And what do the gods want? Sometimes those questions were probably uncomfortably similar. By the time large civilizations surrounded games of chance with specialized equipment, social customs, wagers, rules, and safeguards against cheating, gambling had become more than entertainment. It was a miniature version of civilization itself. Everyone agrees on the rules. Everyone puts something valuable into the system. Nobody knows exactly what will happen. And at least one person leaves furious. The bones were still being thrown. Only now the stakes were getting bigger. Today gambling barely looks ancient. The bones became dice. The dice became casinos. Casinos became websites. And now the entire emotional experience of risking something valuable can happen while you are lying in bed wearing socks that should have been retired 3 years ago. But the psychological machinery underneath all of it is much older. Modern gambling still revolves around the same ingredients ancient humans found so irresistible: uncertainty, Anticipation, social comparison, sudden reward, and the possibility that one unpredictable outcome might completely change your situation. Technology did not invent that feeling. It industrialized it. Casinos learned how to surround uncertainty with lights, sound, speed, and repetition. Sports betting attached it to tribal loyalty. Digital games discovered that randomized rewards can keep people chasing the next outcome even when the reward itself is tiny. The objects changed, but the central question stayed almost embarrassingly simple. What happens if I try one more time? That question is ancient. It probably existed long before formal gambling did, because uncertainty was built into survival itself. The important difference is that our ancestors usually had to face uncertainty. We learned how to manufacture it. That may be the strangest thing about gambling's history. Humans spent millions of years trying to reduce risk, predict the weather, track animals, store food, build shelters, and generally make life less dependent on luck. Then, once we became good enough at controlling uncertainty, we started paying money to experience it again. Very efficient species. So no, there was probably never a single prehistoric genius who invented gambling. There was no first casino, no first jackpot. Just a long chain of humans discovering that chance could be played with, interpreted, ritualized, wagered on, regulated, exploited, and eventually turned into an industry. And somewhere near the beginning of that chain was probably a very ordinary object. A bone. Someone threw it. Someone else watched it land. And sooner or later, one of them had the most human thought imaginable. Want to bet?